small percentage, then they see what they see. And asking a human being to do this manually is a form of torture, something that nobody should be done. So one of the hallmarks of processing analog data is how do you separate out the data that isn't interesting from the little data that is. And that process is called distillation. And if you want to make $1 million, figure out a good way to do distillation. And I promise you, there's a big marketplace out there for it.
Thank you for joining the Data Heads podcast. We're excited to have Bill Inmon here, who is the godfather of data warehousing. And I would argue that he's the godfather of data analytics. And we can get into that, and maybe we'll have a conversation. Bill has probably some different thoughts on that. But Bill has also authored over 60 different books and is still continuing to push the envelope of analytics and data in some of just the most recent speaking engagements that he's had and the work that he's doing. So I want to be able to give him an opportunity to tell how he sees the future of data and where we need to go next. So thank you, Bill, for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, Ian, it's an honor to be invited. As far as the future is concerned, I kind of look at things in a spectrum of evolution. Once upon a time, computing was very simple. You had a program, you had a report, and you had some data you put in. Today, that scenario has expanded beyond belief. Analytics takes many forms today, and analytics is something that is extremely important. One of the pet peeves that I have, much of the world is still hung up on the fact that they think that doing analytics and making progress is the equivalent of buying a new product. And the vendors foster that, and a lot of people believe that. But the day has come when the products that we have in the marketplace, as far as I can tell, all of them depend on a foundation of solid data on which to operate. The problem is there is no solid foundation of data on which to operate. And the products of today are subject to the most basic law of technology, and that is GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And I don't care how cool your technology is, how sophisticated, I don't care what your vendor tells you, if you're operating on data that isn't solid, believable foundation of data, you're not going to be able to use any kind of tool to make any kind of considered decision in the corporation. So I see that there's no shortage of tools that are being developed in the marketplace today. But I think at least a few people are coming around to the realization that the tools that we have in the marketplace today are no better than the foundation of data. Just the other day, I talked with a large insurance company, and they had an interesting observation. The gentleman I was talking with said, our corporation, this was a large corporation, has dedicated $1 billion for new products. And I said, and how much have they dedicated to cleaning up the mess of their data? And they said, not a penny. So not a penny for the foundation of data, but billions of dollars on the new shiny products that the vendors are putting out there.
That's astounding. And you know what? That's every company that seems to go to or interface with is facing that same thing. They just kind of they look at the new shiny toy, and usually it's some sort of senior level management, just resume building, right? It's kind of it's this perpetual cycle. Vendors looking to gain money, and then usually people in higher levels of management looking to resume stack, right? So that way their net worth or their value to be in the marketplace is continuing to grow, because people don't look at the way people think anymore. They look at the way that they're, what have they accomplished and what tools have they used, right? And so that's kind of, it just is this perpetual cycle of as opposed to looking at how do you actually build tangible value to the organization, and that's obviously going to stand on quality data, right?
Well, The good news is there are some people that are out there that are recognizing this.
Right.
Thank the good Lord for that. But it's a sign of the maturity our world that we live in. The word maturity is kind of a funny word because people don't like to be called immature. But
Right.
when you take a look at the history of the computer industry, our industry is a very immature industry because you compare our industry to other industries. The world of computing really began around 1960. But when you compare that to engineering, the walls in Rome that are standing today were designed by an engineer over 2,000 years ago. Take accounting, that we are told that the hieroglyphics on the pyramids of Egypt, that the most of them are some accountant talking about how much grain is owed the Pharaoh. Take medicine. In the
Right.
mountains of Chile, they found some early indications that medicine was practiced in a crude form as long as 10,000 years ago. So when you compare our profession in terms of historical maturity, we're a babe in the woods. We are still growing up, and we got a long ways to go before we ever reach the maturity of, say, medicine, engineering, or accounting. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is there are signs of maturity in our profession. And believe me, if there were no signs, it would be very depressing. But there are people out there that understand the need for maturity. Just the other day, I was reading a LinkedIn message from Chad Sanderson. I don't know if you know Chad Sanderson, but
Yeah.
he's a developer on the west coast of the United States. And he had a wonderful diagram showing that all of these, I'll try to describe it to you. He does it much better than I do. He has all of these new shiny toys afloat on the ocean, and they're floating on an ocean of crummy data. And so, one example of people starting to recognize what needs to be done in our industry. Uh, Again, we are infants in terms of the world profession in which we live.
What's interesting to that is like I've heard like the Japanese have done like a very phenomenal job when it comes to their data, and they've been very meticulous and disciplined. But whereas here in the U.S., it's just the business tends to flow like water, right? And so they're going to find the path of least resistance, and then nobody goes and cleans up all the mess, and it's just then it's like okay, provide analytics over the top of that.
And again, the most basic equation in our industry is GIGO, and
Right.
there's no getting around it.
Given that that's kind of our standard kind of data sets as data's coming into our systems, one of the things, and I don't know if you're interested or willing to talk about it, that we've discussed, and then you actually spoke about it at Day to Day, was just your perception. Well, actually, let me back up a little bit. One of the questions I asked you that floored me, your response, and that was you had kind of gone and fought the battle of the necessity of having a database dedicated to doing analytics, something away from the OLTP systems, which is why I argue that you're probably the godfather of analytics because you couldn't really do that writing queries against the OLTP systems, right? So just in and of, oh, go ahead.
Well, yes, if you turn the clock back many years ago, we had applications, and people built an application for this and that and the other thing. And then one day somebody woke up and said, wait a minute, we need to consolidate these applications. And so the whole notion in academia and elsewhere grew up that we need a database. And what is a database? A database is a single source of data for all processing. And vendors, IBM, academia, everybody stood up and said, yes, this is what a database is, and this is what we need. And given all of the applications that were being built at the time, I can certainly understand where that came from. However, for a wide variety of reasons, it became apparent to me that we didn't need just one database for all processing. We needed
Right.
a separate database for operational transaction processing and another database for analytical processing. And when I first said these words, it was heresy. The academics jumped up and down, IBM jumped up and down, Ted Codd and Chris Date all jumped up and down and said, no, 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 you don't understand database. And being a persistent person, I kept on saying no. And it began to be
And we're
apparent to
grateful
me,
for that, by the way.
well, it was not a particularly pleasant experience. It became apparent to me that the database that we needed for analytics was actually structurally quite different than the database that we needed for operational processing. And once I began to understand what those differences were, then I became more convinced, and I became more convinced. Now, that has led back in those days, and that was a while back there, all the world really had was structured data. In fact, the vast majority of our profession thinks only in terms of structured data and structured techniques and design practices and so forth. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that once upon a time, all there was structured data. Today, there is very different kinds of data that's out there that's not structured at all. In particular, we have textual data. We
So
have,
before
and
we get there, I
sure,
want to go back to the question I asked you that leads into this. And I don't know if you remember this, but you went through that whole period pioneering and kind of fighting the good fight, establishing the need for having that environment where you can actually do the proper analytics, right? And you got beat up for it, like horribly. And my question to you was, at what point did you kind of reach the peak of the mountain and you were looking down over the clouds and was like, we've arrived? Do you
I've
remember what
never
your response was?
I've never reached that peak.
And
And
that's what
and
blew me away. I wasn't expecting that. I thought like, okay, like you got to a place where like we're doing analytics where we have data warehouses, we have a whole data science divisions. Like analytics has just gone so far from the fights that you originally were fighting. And now it's just like for you to say that, it's just kind of like, wow. So if you wouldn't mind just taking it kind of from there where you left off in our conversation there day to day,
let me
that blew
use an
my mind.
analogy. Indeed, I did reach a peak, but then once I was on the peak, I looked up and there was another peak waiting there. One day I sat down and said to myself, why is it that corporations are only using a really small percentage of the data in the corporation? Because if you look at corporations, the vast majority of the data in the corporations is not structured data. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'm not knocking or saying anything bad about
Right.
structured data at all, but I'm saying that that's hardly all there is that's out there. There's a lot of other kinds of data that are out there. There's textual data. And I said to myself, this is really strange because structured data, as interesting and as useful as it is, there's another peak to be climbed. And the next peak is that of textual data. Now, when I first started looking at textual data, I thought, well, maybe the reason why people don't look at or use textual data is because there's nothing useful there. Maybe there isn't anything useful there. And boy, is that not right at all. I said, I tried to find out why aren't people using textual data? And it's not because there's not important data there. There's a lot of reasons why people, one reason why people don't use textual data is text is ghastly complex. We take
Right.
language and speech for granted because we speak it and our brains process it. But our brains in the background of our brains are these mechanisms. I don't know what they are. I'm not a doctor or anything like that. But there's some mechanism that allows us to understand and process speech immediately.
And
Computers don't
contextualize it, right?
well contextualize it, but there's a lot more to it than contextualization. Well, contextualization takes lots of different forms. For example, the tone of your voice. You speak to your wife one way, you speak to your child another way, you speak to your dog another way, you speak to an enemy, if you have one, another way. and just the mere, not what you're saying, just the way you're speaking. My wife, I can tell from what she says. I don't have to listen to her words. I simply can tell from the tone of her voice whether she wants me to come and help her with something, whether she wants to talk about a TV program, or whether she's talking about something else. And it, just from the tone. So tone is an important form of context. Number one, maybe there's nothing important in text. That's not true. Number two, text is inherently complex, and that's a big reason. But there's a third reason, and the third reason is that database management systems are designed to handle structured data. They expect that every record of data has a key, attributes, data in it, and it's uniformly structured in how the database is created. Well, when you go into the world of text, text does not have that same structure. And I could go on and on and on, but there's probably 100 different reasons why text is inherently different from the world of structured systems. And then we get to analog systems. Analog systems are yet completely different from textual data or structured data. So the first peak to be climbed was the data warehousing and structured systems. The second peak to be climbed was how do we handle textual data. The third peak, and I'm not going to live long enough to conquer this peak, but is what do we do about analog data? Because each of these kinds of data have completely different characteristics. So, yes, I did reach a peak, but all that did was let me view where the next peak
What the
was.
next thing is. And see, that's why I feel like to say you're the godfather of just data warehousing would be an understatement in the sense that your mind's continuing to be the visionary of where things are going. And so, do you feel like we're at a place with textual data that we've built out the proper taxonomies necessary for processing and enriching it and turning it into value? Or do you feel like that's still something that there's a huge amount of growth and there's not enough publication of good works and enough actual available resources to make it consumable for the average data team?
That, sir, is like putting a loaded pistol in front of me because that is a very complex and very dangerous question to answer. But I'm going to answer it for you anyway. By the way, this is likely to make a lot of people mad, but the
Good.
truth
So
is the
so
truth.
did so did the idea of a data warehouse, right?
So did the
And
idea of a data warehouse. Oh, did it
so
make people mad?
so I'm
But
glad to give you the platform for this.
the world of taxonomies and what we do in the world of text has been greatly muddied by something called NLP and the academics that promote NLP. I
Hmm.
remember studying NLP when I was in school. And believe me, I was in school when you were probably not even born. So NLP
Yeah.
has been around a long time. NLP has set the world of taxonomies back fully 50 years. NLP is an academic exercise never designed to produce a commercial product. And I know that the people from Stanford and Berkeley and Harvard and Yale and Princeton are going to hear this and say, oh my God, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, let me tell you, in order to produce the taxonomies that we have, and we have the taxonomies the world needs, by the way. So does the world have the taxonomies? If they followed NLP, they don't. If they take a look at, and I'll describe them in a minute, the taxonomies that we have, yes, the world has it. But the world of NLP was grossly misleading. The reason why I'm an expert on NLP is when we set out to do what we do, we followed everything that we could find about NLP. And NLP is full of rabbit holes. And I mean, you can go down one rabbit hole and never come out. And there's so many
Hmm.
misleading things that are absolutely unnecessary and unwanted. and non-productive in NLP, and the academics make such a fuss over it, and it doesn't lead anywhere. So, by the way, the journey I'm describing you took me 20 years of full-time work to figure this out. But NLP, we tried everything we could find in NLP to make it work. We did find a few things, and then we added a few things more on our own. So let me describe the larger picture of taxonomies, ontologies, and data models. The
Okay.
first thing the world thinks it said it needed was something called LLMs, large language models. That was a great theory, but totally impractical. Even if you could build an LLM, which by the way you can't, but if you build a true LLM, it's going to be so large you can't process anything with it. It's impractical. So the next step the world came to was SLMs, small language models. And the small language models cut down LLM needed to look like. And we followed this path, but the SLMs have, at a different level of scaling, the same problems LLMs have. The third step in the progression, and this is what some people are starting to realize now, and this is what we spent 20 years doing, is you don't need SLMs, you need a generic industry data models. You need to not have a data model for the world as an SLM. You need to go industry by industry. You need to
Mm.
have an airlines a language model. You need to have a medical language model. You need to have a
So
telecommunications
so
language
industry
model.
specific taxonomies.
Absolutely. And furthermore, you need to focus these industry specific taxonomies only on the words that are commonly used. Because if you try to focus them on words that are general purpose words, you're never ever going to finish. So when you build your industry specific models, you use only commonly used language. And then you say, gee, Bill, don't different industries have
So
specific terms? Go ahead.
so are you talking about like colloquialisms within the industry or like common words within specific to that industry?
Not even common words to the industry, common words to the company within the industry, because
Oh, okay.
because every company has got their own collection of terms, and Lord knows, employee number is this, and product number, product ID is this, and
Okay. So then
uh,
like what about so that brings about the necessity for like kind of like using data catalogs, using those as a proxy or a source for your taxonomy. Is that correct?
that is correct. So the progression is gone. LLMs to SLM, SLM to industry models to specific company within the industry model. And then there's one more step, and that is that if you do all of this, then you must allow easy customization, because you have to recognize that there always are going to be some terms that are specific to a company and only to a company. What you've done is whittled down the world into a usable, functional understanding of vocabulary for a given company with a given industry. That's the progression that we took us 20 years to go through, and now we are at the point of having those industry language models. I've got my little list here. We have them for airlines, banking, insurance, medical, pharmacy, real estate, restaurants,
Hmm.
telecommunications, oil and gas, railway, and U.S. law. And
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 so
go ahead.
how could the listeners to this gain access to those? Is there a place where they can reach you, or is there a website that we can
Well,
provide
we
the
don't,
listeners to?
because because it took us 20 years to figure out how to do this. We're not really anxious to sell those models. What we will do is allow you to use them, but we will not give them whole cloth to you.
Okay.
And yes, I have a company you can look at. It's called Datavox, DATAVOX. You can use them out of the box. You can use them tomorrow if you wanted to,
Awesome.
but we don't sell them and we don't disclose them. You talk about something that's protected. When we knew that this was going to be valuable intellectual property. And so, in addition to taking all of the security that is standard in our industry, we invented our own security. And so, I'm not going to say that we can't be broken into, but I'm going to say you better have an IQ close to Einstein to figure out how to do it, because there's the things in there that you probably expect, but there's a lot of things in there that you don't expect. Furthermore, we've hidden them away. So we protect them. We tried to get patents on them. The patent office is difficult to deal with, and so we recognize if we really want to secure what we have, we've got to do it ourselves.
And so is that going to be a charged service of use, or is that just a free of use? And you're excited?
No, it's going to be a charge service, but it's going to be done on a very inexpensive basis, so that we're not out to scalp anybody, and we want everybody to be able to use it at a very reasonable price. So that's a little bit about the notion of language models. We got a 20-year head start on everybody. We hope and pray we put it to good use. So that's a little bit about language models and where we're at. Let me talk very briefly about analog data. Analog data has a very different property than textual data has. Well, textual, analog, and structured, all three very different properties. I get a real kick out of people that have had nothing but structured data and sitting around writing books and talking about as if they know what's going on. They're in the dark on the vast majority of data. So let me
What's
talk
the
a
low
little.
hanging fruit, right?
Well, the low hanging fruit. Let me talk about the two places where there's great value waiting to be plucked in text. One of them is in terms of medical research. That if you've ever looked at a medical record, medical records contain something called doctor's notes. And doctor's notes are in the form of text, and doctor's notes, quite frankly, are where a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the real value of a medical record is. And yet it's in the form of text. Those doctor's notes are written for another doctor to read and for the patient. But if you want to look at 100,000 patients or even 1 million patients, nobody on this earth can sit down and read and make sense of 100,000 of anything. The human brain just doesn't work that way.
Right.
What we have is in those doctor's notes is invaluable information. You've got to turn that textual information into the form of a database. And in doing so, now, once you put your doctor's notes into the form of a database, now you can start to look at 100,000 patients all at the same time. We did a study a while back on COVID. The things that fell out of our COVID analysis were absolutely amazing. By being able to look at, I don't remember the number of records we looked at, I think 10,000 records is what we were able to get hold of and look at. We looked at the records and such things as how does COVID relate to smoking? How does COVID relate to the taking of other drugs? How does COVID relate to other diseases? This information just falls out. And we were able to do the analysis and the information preparation in a matter of hours. And we have a competing study that took on COVID something like 6 months to do. And we were able to do a better job than they could. And the only reason we could do it is because we converted the text into a database. And with the analytical tools that we have today, with things like knowledge graphs, with things like dashboards, even Excel spreadsheets, you're able to do analytics very easily and very elegantly. So the one low-lying fruit is in the world of medical research. Now, I say research because we've been looking hard at medical clinical analysis. And the difference I don't know if you're familiar with the terms, but the difference between clinical and research is clinical is what happens when you have one doctor sitting there working with one patient. And we've not been able to find a really important use for understanding text clinically, but boy, in medical research, that's a huge low-lying fruit. The second low-lying fruit is in terms of sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is not a new idea, but sentiment analysis has a history of not being done properly. When sentiment analysis first came out, it was thought that the way you do sentiment analysis is to look at your sales reports and find out what people were buying, and that would tell you about sentiment. And indeed, that does tell you a little bit about sentiment. The problem is the sentiment it tells you about is after the sale has been made. And
Right.
that's not when the retailer wants to hear about sentiment analysis. The retailer wants to hear customer sentiment long before the buy decision has been made. And so sentiment analysis came out. It was a really good idea, but it was a very poor implementation. And so today, when you say you do sentiment analysis, people says, "Oh yeah, we tried that and it didn't work very well. So let's go on to something else." And we
Right.
say, "Wait a minute, we're talking about sentiment analysis of a different kind, a variety of which you are aware. We're talking about sentiment analysis for understanding what people are thinking before they make the buy or not buy decision." And so however, that's another very much low-lying fruit. Now, there's a lot of other fruit that's out
So
there.
do you have do you have a taxonomy that you prefer to use for sentiment analysis on products or customers' perspectives on that? Like their
let me
comments and feedback?
Let me tell you what we have, and I'll try to describe it to you succinctly. We have a library of taxonomies. We've got a library of accounting terms, a library of financial terms, a library of marketing terms, a library of sentiment terms. We've got a library of commonly used airline terms, a library of telecommunications terms. And we have the airlines and telecommunications terms broken up into internal vocabularies and external vocabularies. You need both of them. For
Right.
example, in airlines, airline people have talk about the airplane, the pitch of the airplane, the actual altitude, and all kinds of things. And customers of the airlines aren't really interested in that. Believe me, pilots are interested in that, and the air
Right.
traffic controllers interested in that.
Of
But
course.
but no, on the other hand, customers of airlines are interested in things called baggage, reservation, upgrades, seating, and things like that. So when you do these industry vocabularies, you have to look at both the internal and the external. So what we have is a library of all of these terms, a rather extensive library of all of these terms. And so when somebody says, give us a comprehensive library for, let's say, restaurant management, what we do is we pick up the commonly used terms in restaurant, we add the accounting terms, the marketing
Mhm.
terms,
So you bundle them
the
together. You don't just kind of let them live in isolation. It's going to be a concert of the blend of that. So if you had a, let's say, a banking company, right, and you wanted to know based off of their comments, and you were trying to do that sentiment analysis, you would use banking as well as your sentiment analysis and maybe one or two more to kind of get that full circumspect, the appropriate taxonomy that's going to fit that niche.
Absolutely. And it takes us less than 60 seconds to put all of this together. It's bing, 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 bing,
Wow.
and it's done. That gives you great flexibility because accounting terms are the same for any publicly traded corporation. Financial terms are not quite the same, but from the 10K forms that corporations have to file, they're very uniform. They're not as uniform as accounting terms. And so, yes, I liken it to Legos. We've got this big group of Legos on the floor, and
I
when it
love
comes
that.
time to use them, we just go pluck the little Legos together, and bang, we have it. And it literally, and I'm not joking, we can do it in, I don't know, maybe 120 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, but 1 or 2 minutes is what it takes us to build a complete taxonomy.
That's awesome. That's incredible. So, do you have any success stories that you've been able to accomplish with that you can speak about, where you've been able
Um,
to?
well, I have success stories about the usage of the technology.
Yeah, that's
That
what I'm talking about.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you the one that I use. It's hardly the only one, but one that is very real. Okay, a while back we were looking for a way to demonstrate the value of looking at the voice of the customer, and so we were looking for something. At that time, we had a friend of ours who worked for marketing management for Nike. She said, Bill, she says, Nike is losing market share to Adidas and they don't know why. Can you help us out? So we went out to the internet and we got the comments from 5,000 Nike customers and 5,000 Adidas customers, and we put them through the system. As far as I can tell, Adidas is a normal, well run company. But when it came to Nike, something interesting happened. About 40% of the comments from Nike said, I bought my Nike shoe. 2 months later, I had a problem with my Nike shoe. It no longer is anything I can walk in, and Nike won't replace the shoe and stand behind their product. Nike was expensive, and I'll never buy Nike again. And so, and by the way, it didn't take our product to learn this. Anybody from Nike or anybody else could have gone out to the internet and read what we found. It was public domain, and we found it. So, anyway, we wrote up this report to Nike Marketing Management and said, Dear ma'am, sir, we've made a report. We think we found some interesting information. We'd like for you to find it to see what we found. They came back to us and said, Mr. Inman, this is embarrassing information. We can't let anybody see it. So, not to be dissuaded, I wrote a letter to the president of Nike at the time, a gentleman named Mark Parker. And I said, Mr. Parker, we're an independent survey organization. We found some information we think you will find to be valuable. It was not a snarky letter. It was an informational, factual letter that described to him what we had found. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from president of Nike saying, Dear Mr. Inman, Nike listened to certain consultants. You're not one of them. We don't want to hear from you again. And so I said, well, okay. 6 months later, there was something very interesting that happened. There happened to be a basketball game between Duke and North Carolina. At the time, it had the largest television audience of any basketball game in history. And even the President of the United States attended the game. In the first 60 seconds of the game, a guy named Zion Williamson, who was the star for Duke, came running down the court in his Nike shoes with his swoosh imminently displayed in front of 10 million people, and the shoe exploded. The sole became disengaged from the shoe. He hurt his foot, was unable to continue in the game, and Duke lost the game. The next day, the Nike stock dropped by $2 billion, not million,
Wow.
$2 billion. What we found out later and didn't know at the time, all we knew was that people were complaining about the Nike shoe. What we didn't know was Nike had changed the glue on their shoe. There's a glue that holds the sole of the shoe to the shoe itself, and Nike was using defective glue. Now, after we had done our research, we published an article in the public describing the research. It wasn't a gotcha article for Nike. It was simply showing what can be done by looking at and understanding the voice of your customer. And
Right.
so I started getting letters from Nike lawyers. The good news is And I explained to the lawyers that we had not gone into any file or database that Nike had. All we had done is gone out to the internet and looked at public domain data. And Nike does not have any foundation for saying that their public domain data is private, because it isn't. If it's out on the internet, it's put out there for the public to
Right.
consume. And all we did was consume it. But and by the way, I still have in my computer those comments from Nike as well. So that's one example of a case study of what it means to be able to use textual information to improve your business.
That is amazing. So, do you have any forms of, if somebody was to use some of these taxonomies that you're talking about and use some of the tools you're talking about, does your team kind of walk them through? Here's the best way to leverage the value from it, or is there any forms of tutorials or videos, or
Well, okay, let me explain something. In addition to everything else, we have made the interface to using our technology as simple as using an ATM machine. If a person can use an ATM machine, they can
awesome?
use our technology. There are four things you have to know before you use our technology. Number one, what language are you processing in? Because we process in multiple languages. So, number one, you got to tell us what you're processing in. Number two, you got to tell us what's on your mind, because we've got taxonomies for airlines and restaurants and medicine, etc., and so forth. So, number two, you got to tell us who are you doing this for. Number three, you got to give us a name so that we can identify the output, so that when you see the output, you'll know that it's yours. And number four, what documents do you want us to process? So you got to tell us the documents, how you want to identify the output, what you want to do, and what language you want to process in. So that is such basic information that even
Right.
a freshman in high school could do it.
Amazing. So that's awesome. So for the listeners, obviously this is an incredible, valuable tool, and you need to go and take a look at it. I think that Bill's made his case pretty clear that these tools have been available, and he's conquered this next mountain for you already. So the last piece you were saying was analog. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you mind, just for our listeners, just doing a brief definition of what you mean by analog, so they can understand? Yeah.
Analog data is all around us. You may not be aware of it, but analog, you're surrounded by analog data right now. Analog data is data that's created by a machine measuring something. Let me give you a very simple example of analog data. Suppose you were a camera, security camera, overlooking a parking lot at a some kind of business. So here you are at this camera, looking at the parking lot. You're taking snapshots, like one snapshot every 30th of a second. That's what TV runs at, and that's what a TV camera looks like. So you can think of these huge number of snapshots. What does your camera see? Well, at nighttime, it sees an empty parking lot, most likely. During the daytime, what does it see? It sees people arriving in their cars, people getting out and going to work. In the afternoon, they go to their cars and they go leave the parking lot. So, how interesting and useful is the information that we've talked about so far? The answer is not very useful. However, one day during lunchtime, somebody breaks into a car. Somebody's got something valuable in the car, and somebody breaks into it. The camera takes a picture of, say, 60 seconds worth of this break in. How valuable is that information? And the answer is it's extremely valuable. So, what happens with analog data? We end up using a mechanical device to gather data, and we typically gather huge amounts of data that have little or no business value. But we gather a few small pieces of data that have extreme amount of business value. Interesting question. How do the police do that today? Well, when the police are looking for some kind of suspect for some kind of crime, they gather all of the video that they can find, and some poor soul has got to sit there in a chair all day long and look at this thing. They're going to go blind because 99.99% of the time they're seeing information that has no value. Small percentage, then they see what they see. And asking a human being to do this manually is a form of torture, something that
Right.
nobody should be done. So, one of the hallmarks of processing analog data is how do you separate out the data that isn't interesting from the little data that is. And that process is called distillation. And if you want to make $1 million, figure out a good way to do distillation. And I promise you, there's a big marketplace out there for it.
Well, thank you, Bill, so much for your time. We really appreciate you speaking with us, and I want to be respectful of your time. And so, thank you again for just kind of walking us through the journey, really of your work life, right? And starting from data warehousing and all the fights, moving into a database for analytics to what you've been able to accomplish in textual data that's not even being leveraged, and you have it available for those who are wanting it. You're seeing the next peak. Are you currently trying to conquer that, or is that something that you're leaving to the next generation?
My total energy is spent on the textual world. I know what the next peak is, but I'm not going to be the person that conquers it.
Well, I mean, you've still accomplished quite a bit. So,
I've been
and
busy.
I do hope that the narrative shifts, that it's not just the godfather of data warehousing, that history will call you the godfather of analytics. So,
And by the way, I much prefer Godfather to Father because the Godfather was the person in the movies that could put a horse's head in a man's bed without the man knowing it. Now that's power. And being the father, I'm the father of a wonderful daughter, and that's wonderful, but I prefer the Godfather.
yeah, well, I'm more than happy to give you that title, and hopefully it sticks.
Well, thank you.
So, again, thank you, Bill.